Game of Thrones, Season 8, Episode 2, episode review. Yeah, so I started doing this last week. I mentioned at the time I was going to experiment with trying to give weekly reviews of each of the episodes of the final seasons of Game of Thrones. It has occurred to me that maybe this isn't actually my best idea, because I don't actually have a lot of coherent thoughts or strong opinions after each particular episode. I think my review last week was a prime example of that, where I rambled on for quite some time, but didn't say really anything of value. It's quite possible they're all going to be like that, but having started this project, I'm just going to try and muddle through it. This episode, however, I think is a little bit easier to review because it had a very coherent theme, which makes it somewhat easier to have a coherent review. There's something there, and you can either react to it positively or you can react to it negatively. But there's definitely like a unified whole that you can react to. And the unified whole this time, the definite theme of this episode was, we all used to be enemies, but now we're all in this together against the ice zombies. Right, so I guess start off by maybe talking about the pacing or something like this. This is the final season, and there's been so much build up to the final season, and kind of, it's, you know, the series itself has been kind of building up to a final showdown against the ice zombies right from episode 1. But even kind of outside of the series, kind of the media event and all the internet buzz around the series has been building this up. So there is definitely a sense of like, all right, the final season, things are finally going to happen. And then we had last week's episode, which was just, not much really happened. It was just kind of catching up on where people were, which I found a little bit boring. But then, to be honest, I kind of thought, well, actually, if I'm being honest, I kind of needed to be caught up on where everyone was. Some of my friends, probably some of your friends as well, did like a Game of Thrones marathon before the 8th season, where they kind of rewatched all 7 seasons and caught themselves up on everything. But I didn't have time to do this, and kind of I haven't taken a scientific poll or something, but my gut instinct is probably the majority of the world did not have time to do that. So that means for the most of us, it's been kind of 2 years since season 7, and you know, with all of these characters and plot lines to keep track of. And you know, that's assuming everyone's been watching every episode, which they haven't been. I mean, you know, like the diehard fans have been, but I think a lot of people have been dipping in and out of this series, the kind of casual fans. So we probably needed a Where Are They Now episode to catch us up at the beginning of this season, and I think that's how TV series usually operate, and the people who are writing this know what they're doing. So I was thinking, okay, we had that. Now we're gonna get into the action. And the episode opened, and I thought, okay, a few character beats, the action's coming. And then about halfway through the episode, I realized this is gonna be all character moments. There's gonna be no action in this episode. And then I probably don't get any points for predicting this, but my prediction is the next episode is going to be like a huge action episode, because that's just how television works. Yeah, although we'll see. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if I'm right or wrong. Actually, I say that. It's a fairly safe bet, isn't it? It would be interesting if I was wrong. Yeah. So, bunch of character moments, and they worked well for the most part. Yeah, I guess kind of looking at this story as a whole, there have been a lot of callbacks to season 1 in the first 2 episodes of season 8. Perhaps this will be a theme that goes out throughout the whole series, kind of unifying seasons 1 and seasons 8, which is cool. But it is it has kind of made me worthwhile to think back to season 1 and remember the possibilities that this show held at that time, right? I mean, not only season 1, but maybe the first 2 seasons. So, like, you had, like, all this internal fighting and all these conspiracies and all these machinations and all this plotting and all these people kind of plotting against each other and all that, which was very interesting. But then on the north, you had these ice zombies kind of coming down. And in the south, you had something about these dragons who were being born. And you knew that the woman, the dragon lady, was planning to kind of come north and kind of retake the Iron Throne. So both from the north and from the south, you had these very, supernatural and also incredibly dangerous. What's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, you had these very dangerous threats. Dangerous is kind of underselling it, huh? What's the word I'm looking for? Anyways, from the north you had the ice zombies. From the south you were going to have the dragons. And in the middle you had these people who were fighting and just were not aware or weren't paying attention to the huge dangers that were to the north and to the south. And that was kind of the hook that got you in. And you're like, all right, what's going to happen? Are they going to get their act together and kind of unify and realize that their entire civilization is going to be wiped out? Or are they going to keep fighting each other right as the ice zombies and the dragons kind of come up and come down? And that was the hook. And then that was something that the series just kind of milked for about 6 seasons, right? Because right at the beginning you thought, oh no, the ice zombies are coming. And then season 2, it's like, okay, they're right there. And season 3, it's like, all right, they're still right there. Any day now they're going to be coming down. And season 4, it's like, ooh, they're still up there. And it just kind of melted and melted and melted. But it did kind of keep the tension. The same kind of thing with the dragons in the south. I mean, I know Khaleesi and everything went on all her own adventures down there, but they were largely disconnected from what was happening up in the northern world, and it was just largely just kind of to remind you that this character was still here and still alive and still potentially a threat. Now, yeah. I think really the fascination of that is it was not at all clear how the screenwriters were going to resolve this. And therein lies a lot of the fascination. Actually, this reminds me, I was reading somebody's blog, Freddie DeBoer, if anyone follows him. And he was writing about this age of prestige TV. And I'm going to paraphrase what he was saying a little bit. But he was saying... oh, actually, maybe he posted this on Twitter. Anyways, he was saying, like, the thing with prestige TV is you get, with both kind of Game of Thrones and Westworld and a lot of these shows, you get hooked with an amazing premise right from kind of the first episode. But then the writers don't really seem to deliver that premise to the fullest potential. Or, you know, like maybe they can't. Or like maybe the potential, the thing that you get hooked on is that there are so many possibilities this could go for. And the writers can't really follow them in all of them. You know, they can't do all possibilities. So eventually they have to choose one possibility. And at that point, the show becomes a little bit more boring. But I guess the glass half full, I mean, it's positive and negative. I think he was portraying it as a negative. Like, we've all been hoodwinked a bit. This prestige TV is not as exciting as we think it is. It's just a really exciting premise that then the writers can't deliver on. But the flip side of that, especially because of the medium of TV and how you have to wait every week to find out what's going to happen, unless you binge it, Even if you binge it though, like it, you can't possibly watch all of this in one day. It still takes a few days to get through. Like in a movie, you get hooked on a premise, and then like 2 hours later, you find out, okay, that premise wasn't as interesting as I thought it was, or the writers didn't deliver. For a TV series, for better or for worse, and maybe for better, it's allowed to linger in your imagination. So you get to kind of spend all these weeks kind of thinking about it. Oh, what are they going to do? This is interesting. This is interesting. And maybe that's the fun of a TV show, or that's the whole point of it. Anyways, sorry, I'm rambling. There were a lot of possibilities this could go, and one possibility was that the human characters were never going to get their act together. They were going to keep fighting and backstabbing and fighting and backstabbing, right where the dragons kind of came up and the ice zombies kind of came down. And I mean, on one level, that kind of seems a little bit unrealistic, right? Like, surely the moment people realize there's ice zombies coming, they're going to kind of unify. On the other hand, maybe it's not all that unrealistic. I think you could find a lot of historical precedents where civilizations kind of fell apart or were conquered because they were so busy fighting each other that they just couldn't get themselves unified to address the outside force that was coming in. And I'm a little bit hesitant to give examples because I have these are just off the top of my head, and I actually haven't gone back and read up on these. But I think maybe like the Gauls. The Gauls never unified themselves against the Romans. China, during certain periods of its history, got conquered by outsiders because they were so busy fighting each other. I think this was part of the reason that the Christian empires of antiquity fell to the Muslims, because they were never able to they were so busy fighting each other, they could never put up a unified front against the Ottomans. To a certain extent, this was a tragedy of the Native Americans, although that's drastically oversimplifying it, and probably a lot of other stuff, and probably that's an oversimplification. But I do think there is an element in history where people's, during these civil wars, your hatred of each other is kind of so strong that you hate the rivals in your own country more than you hate the outside enemy. And in fact, what often happens in these cases is that one faction in the Civil War will invite in the outside enemy. They'll kind of form an alliance with the outside enemy just because they want to gain power over the other faction within their own civil war. If I was going to prognosticate about the political future of America, I don't think there's an outside enemy that's going to be invited in anytime soon. But it does certainly seem like we've gotten to the point where fighting against each other is much more important than kind of unifying against kind of any existential threats that may be facing the nation. Now, I don't think there's like China or Russia or anything like. I don't think there's a military threat at the moment. Certainly there's an environmental threat. That's a different subject. Actually, where am I going with this? Maybe this isn't going to kind of help my point. I'm worried about all the political infighting in America. I'll just leave it at that. That's a separate subject. All that is to say, I think you could have told the story where the human characters never unified together. And they kept backstabbing and kept fighting and kept backstabbing and kept fighting, even as the zombies and the dragons were coming in. And then maybe at a certain point, then I don't know what would have happened. Maybe after the zombies and the dragons had gained so much territory, maybe a handful of survivors would have had to kind of unify, or I don't know. How would that series have ended? Oh, see, that's why I can't be the screenwriter, is I don't know how to end these series. But that was the intriguing idea of it. Now in the 7th season, this idea kind of largely got thrown away in exchange for kind of we're all unified against the bad guys now. And that's really solidified in this most recent episode, Season 8, Episode 2. But that was starting to be set up in Season 7. And a number of people pointed out at the time that maybe this was because this was the point where there were no longer any books to go back to for source material. So maybe that's causing this change in tone. And it'll be interesting to see where the books go with this when George R.R. Martin finally gets around to publishing them. I say that as somebody who hasn't read any of the books yet, but might at some point. Or if I don't, I'll at least read their synopsis on Wikipedia someday or something. I don't know. But yeah, like Season 7 was setting up that, okay, we have the dragons, but they are no longer an existential threat now. The dragons are kind of unifying with Jon Snow and the House of Stark, and potentially everyone was kind of unified together in Season 7. Now, yeah, Cersei is still like the human bad guy and kind of the threat from the south. Yeah, the last 2 episodes, she has been so far out of the picture that it's hardly kind of worth commenting on. I mean, I know they'll bring her back. And they mentioned her in this episode and they were talking about her, but yeah, she wasn't there. This whole episode was all about people saying, oh, you old so-and-so, we used to fight all the time, you and me, but now we're together against the ice dragons, the ice zombies. And that was pretty much this whole episode. It was just a whole bunch of different characters meeting up and saying, all right, we're on the same team now. That was the one theme that you kept getting hit over and over on the head with this episode. Yeah, and again, I think that's one way to resolve this story. You do feel like you're kind of losing a little bit this time because those ice zombies, they're a big deal now, obviously. But for many episodes kind of in the middle of the series, they were kind of forgotten about. I mean, they were maybe mentioned once in an episode, or I'd have to go back and rewatch to say this with certainty, but I'm fairly certain there were some episodes where they didn't get mentioned at all, where all the focus was on kind of the political infighting around the Iron Throne and the human characters. And it does feel a little bit like that's the story we signed up for. I mean, we always knew that these ice zombies were out there, but the story we got invested in was kind of the infighting between these human characters and who was going to come out on top or who was going to betray who. And now the fact that they've all kind of forgotten about their quarrels to fight against the ice zombies feels like we're kind of getting cheated out of the story we signed up for. Yeah, although I have mixed feelings about this, because on the other hand, at this point in the series, we've gotten a certain amount of attachment to all these characters. I mean, Jaime Lannister, who figured very prominently in this episode at certain points, is a classic example. He is a character who has a lot of bad points and a lot of good points. And it's hard to decide exactly how you feel about him, but you spent so much time with him at this point that you've kind of developed somewhat of an attachment to him. And I would be sad if he got killed off. And that's true of almost all of the characters at this point. I think that the 2 exceptions are maybe that... what's the guy's name? Euron Greyjoy in the Mountain. And maybe Cersei, although Cersei has had her sympathetic spots at points. but they seem to be setting her up as the villain for season 8. So at this point, we're no longer supposed to feel sympathetic for her. Yeah. So because of that, I didn't really want to see any of these characters kill each other. Even though, like, I know, like, the Starks are supposed to be, like, the main characters. I would have felt a little bit bad if one of the Starks had kind of killed Jaime Lannister, because you have a certain amount of affection for Jaime Lannister, even after all the stuff he's done. So, from that perspective, and just in terms of, like, giving the audience what they want, it's nice to see them all on the same team. And, probably a lot of them will die in the next few episodes, but they'll be killed by ice zombies. They'll be killed by the external enemy, which will have a different emotional payoff to it. Like, it'll feel different than if they had killed each other. If they had killed each other, you would have been like, it's so sad that they could never just have kind of solved their differences. If they're killed by the ice zombies, you're like, well, I don't know, it's got kind of a Spartans at Thermopylae type feel. You're like, they went down fighting to protect our freedom, something like that. The emotional payoff for the death is going to be different. It's going to be a noble sacrifice type death, as opposed to most of the deaths in the previous 6 seasons, which have just been kind of pointless, senseless deaths because of all this kind of pointless, senseless, power-grabbing fighting. On the other hand, that's what made the series so interesting. This whole kind of War of the Roses type stuff, where, you do have these, in history, you do have these pointless, senseless type fighting between powerful families and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is there are many different ways that this last season could have gone. By season 7, it was apparent that they were setting this up. But if you kind of go back a few seasons, there were many different ways that they could have resolved this whole thing. This was always on the cards somewhere. I think we were always kind of suspecting that one way they could end this is have everybody just join together and fight the ice zombies. So it's not entirely surprising they did this. And again, especially because season 7 was blatantly setting this up. At the same time, this is a shift. It's not exactly the show we signed up for at the beginning. But it'll be interesting either way. I'll be looking forward to seeing what happens in the next episode. Because whatever happens, it'll be interesting at this point.